Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is going to be an episode taken from a book by Hyam Maccoby, a Jewish scholar who's passed on in 2004. And the book will be called The Mythmaker, Paul and the Invention of Christianity, a very famous book. And you can look at it and read it online for free. I'm going to give you the archive.org Internet Archive web link, and then you'll see you can just flip the pages and you can read it. Now, the title of this episode is Maccoby Says Paul Was Not a Pharisee Nor Knew Hebrew. Now, this goes to the very heart of a couple of issues. In the book of Acts, we learn that Paul allegedly was a student of Gamaliel. Obviously, that's coming from Paul's mouth, so Luke is trusting that is true. Now, the other problem is, did Paul really know Hebrew? Well, he quotes incessantly texts that don't equal the Hebrew, and people say it's the Septuagint of the Torah or the Septuagint of the Christian era. The Septuagint translation was a work principally of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, done at orders of Ptolemy, the leader of Egypt in the 257 BC period. And some people claim that a Septuagint was continued later, but most likely that was just Christians assembling their own quotations into a Septuagint, something they were continuing to label the Septuagint later. That's at least what modern scholarship is now showing. There was just scraps of paper with no title Septuagint on it that would have been old enough to constitute something that you could take as a not pre-Christian document. Anyway, but the point is that Paul was claiming, you see here in Acts 22, verse 3, he says he was brought up in this city, the city of Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel. He was a famous Pharisee leader. In fact, he was the head of the Pharisees in his day. And Paul claims he was educated according to the strictness of the ancestral law. And what Mr. Maccoby will say is that means you had to be looking at Hebrew, not a Aramaic text, not a Syriac text, and clearly not a Greek text. But Paul is only relying upon a Greek text, and you can tell that by his translations. They're not conforming to Hebrew, they're conforming to standard Greek Septuagint Torah translations, standard Christian Torah, Christian non-Torah, meaning the law and the prophets and the minor prophets and so on in the Psalms. So that's the main evidence that he's going to rely upon. That Paul, how could Paul be a Pharisee when he's not using what the Pharisees would use, which is the actual Hebrew law? And because he's not using the Hebrew law, we can conclude he didn't get trained in Hebrew, and he didn't get trained by Gamaliel. And so this is a person who's professing to teach us about a Hebrew Bible, who doesn't and claim he has a superior learning and education, which he proves he doesn't have over and over again. That's a very serious claim, but we'll see what the evidence is now. Just quickly, Hyam Maccoby was a Jewish British scholar, dramatist, specializing in the study of Jewish and Christian religious traditions. He was known for his theories of the historical Jesus and the origins of Christianity. In fact, Maccoby was very admiring of Jesus and even thought he had a lot of good traits that were similar to the good qualities of the Pharisees, their kind approach to the law and reading it in a way that would be helpful to humans to function. He was also Maccoby was a teacher at Oxford University. He was in the World War II group called Royal Signals of the UK. He later became a librarian of Leo Back College in London. He retired to Leeds and so on and so forth. He was known for Jewish studies. And I'm not going to go into all of this for now. I just want to let you know is he admired the original church under James. You could tell they were strictly Orthodox. You can just see that in Acts 21 where they're telling Paul, hey, look at all these Jewish people who've come to Christ and they're very strictly following the law, but they're going to hear you're an apostate. That's the word Paul was the word James used with Paul. And so you have to prove to them you're not an apostate and so on and so forth. And that's a big part of this book by Maccoby. He has a whole focus on that. He also thinks the Ebionites have been improperly treated derogatorily when they're actually closer to the original 12's beliefs and Jesus' beliefs. He has theories on Paul. I'm not going to go into all of them here, but he does say this, or this is in the summary of Wikipedia. Maccoby claimed that an examination of the New Testament indicates that Paul knew no Hebrew at all and relied entirely on Greek texts that no actual Pharisee would ever use because they were not properly translated from the Hebrew originals. So that's what we're going to look at today, the evidence for that, because he gives evidence, and then you can make your decision. And what's the decision you should make is somebody's telling us a big fib when he says, I was brought up at the feet of Gamaliel. No, you couldn't be, because you would not have used the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. You would have used the Hebrew Bible that you copied as a student when you were working or studying under Gamaliel. And more importantly, even if you didn't have one available, you would hunt it down. You wouldn't use a Greek translation someone else made. That would be irresponsible, because you may be misleading people what the actual text said in Hebrew. And it's very clear that Paul understood he was supposed to, as a student of Gamaliel, be very strict about the ancestral law, which means you have to use Hebrew. You cannot use Greek. You cannot use any substitute at all. You have to have the original. And yet he's going to show you Paul didn't have that. So this information starts being given to us beginning at chapter 6, was Paul a Pharisee, at page 50. And I just think this is one of the first remarks he made that was of interest to me. We oftentimes think the word Christ or Messiah is just obviously God or a divine figure, but that's not absolute. It's absolutely not what it means. It means an anointed figure who would be a king. So he says Jesus would not have understood the new meaning attached by Paul to the title Christ or Messiah, by which it became a divine title instead of the time-honored designation of Jewish royalty. So that's all it means. It means you're an anointed king. Messiah means anointed. So Paul made it into something totally different. But that also means Paul's creating his own new vocabulary, his own new meaning of words. The word anointed no longer means what it used to mean. It used to mean you were a royal figure. And how many people realize that Jesus is the Davidic heir and should be the king of Israel if Rome had collapsed, right? But you don't know that because Paul doesn't educate you that the word Christ even means anything like that. The Gospels show you that, by the way, because the woman anoints Jesus with oil, and that was an example of being anointed, which a king would be anointed. And the second remark he makes is that Jesus, a Pharisee, he believes Jesus was a Pharisee, as I said, close in doctrine, being more concerned about the good for man from God's law rather than keeping the law too technically. So Jesus did have some aspects like that, and you can see that in the Sermon on the Mount. Anyway, Jesus, a Pharisee, that's what he says, would never have understood or accepted this new conception that he's a God king of some sort, which he would have regarded as blasphemous and idolatrous, and as contradicting the Jewish historical role as the opponents of God kings. So the messiahs were opposed to people who created God kings, and so that's why God made sure we all knew it was from a human line, the human line of David. It would become from his seed, and he'd be a man like me, according to what Yahweh told Moses in Isaiah, in Deuteronomy 18, verses 16 to 19. Yet Paul, for whom Jesus was both a God king and a human sacrifice, claimed to have been educated and trained as a Pharisee. So how did he get so far afield of the real meaning of the word Christos, which is so central to modern Christianity, but was foreign to Christ himself? He never spoke this way, that he was a God king. In fact, he denied he was God in John chapter 17, verse 1 to 3. He addresses the Father and he says, Father, you're the only true God. How about that? We just ignore that, but that's what he said. Now it goes on. Paul is the raving, violent Pharisee who's outraged by Jesus' message and wishes to bring destruction to his movement. So now he's talking about the pre-Damascus Paul. Gamaliel, now it's in this time period, he's studying under Gamaliel. Okay, so now he's going to use what we do know about Gamaliel's attitude towards Christianity, which was very lenient, versus how Paul's behaving in a raving, violent way. And why would he be so different than his teacher? And again, this is to make the point, Paul could not have been a Pharisee, nor could he have been a student of Gamaliel and have this violent, raving behavior against the Christians. Okay. Gamaliel is an authentic historical character whose attitudes can be understood perfectly in the light of knowledge of the period. But Saul is a mere caricature, a bogeyman Pharisee whose motivations cannot be understood at all. I mean, they don't fit in anything of a Pharisee. That's the key. It can be fit into someone who's serving the Roman Empire, because that would be what he's doing. He's getting rid of people who believe there's a person who's going to be king. Remember, the true meaning of the Christos, or Messiah, means king, an anointed person who will rule. At least it cannot be understood if Saul really was a Pharisee, but they can be understood very well if he was not one. So what he's trying to show you is all the facts line up that Paul is not a Pharisee, because his behavior, being violent and anti-Christian, is totally contrary to the way Gamaliel was advising. It's in the book of Acts that he advised leniency. And here we must examine Paul's relationship with the high priest, for this is the best clue we have for the truth. Meaning the high priest is really the key. The high priest was an agent of Rome. These were not high priests in the traditional sense that you might think. They were basically, it's an office, a single office of the head of the church, not church, but the synagogues, or the temple, the clergy. And this gentleman, the high priest, would have a police force. Maccoby goes on, the high priest, as we have seen, and as the New Testament bears witness, was the leader of the Sadducees, and that's a party, a group, and as such was in continual conflict with the Pharisees, not only on religious matters, but also on the political question of how far to collaborate with the Roman occupation, where the main difference between them was that the Sadducees were willing to cooperate actively with the Romans, so they're pro-Roman, and that's important. They're being appointed. Herod was appointing him in this time period. Herod is a Roman agent, and he's appointing the high priest. So Herodians would be a natural ally of the high priest, for example. If Paul was a Herodian, as the evidence proves, both in Romans 13, where he salutes his relative Herodion, that means he's a relative of one of the Herod's sons of Herod, or grandsons of Herod, and in Acts 13, verse 1, where Manaen is a childhood friend of Herod the Tetrarch and Saul being Paul. So Saul was raised together with Manaen and Herod the Tetrarch, the guy who sent Jesus back to Pontius Pilate to have him killed. So those are the kind of friends Paul was growing up with. Anyway, even if this meant handing over troublemakers to them for execution, as an appointee of the Romans, the high priest was not just a ceremonial official with jurisdiction over the temple. He was, in effect, a chief of police with his own armed force, his own police tribunal, which was concerned with political offenses, and his own penal system, including prisons and arrangements for flogging offenders. End of quote. I just want to make clear, Paul repeatedly says he was working for the high priest, going into various places to arrest people. So he's never claiming that he's serving the Sanhedrin. He's claiming he's working for the high priest in those episodes, which he says that's what he's doing. In the case of capital offenses, however, such as serious insurrection against the power of Rome, he would hand over the offender. That means the high priest would hand over the offender to the occupying Roman power rather than attempt to impose sentence himself. So that could perfectly explain, if Paul is really representative of the Roman Herodian family, that the high priest would allow Paul to arrest people and thereby hand over to the Herodians people that they wanted to kill, which would have been the Christians, who were people who were following the political goal, according to the Romans, of having to institute Jesus as a new king in place of Herod. And remember, that's what Herod ordered would be the charge nailed to the cross as the king of the Jews. Now here's where Maccoby's knowledge of being a Jewish person, a Jewish historian, this is where he starts to help us out. Thus, if the Jesus movement had been a heretical one, espousing theological doctrines that contradicted the traditional tenets of Judaism, the high priest would have been entirely unconcerned, being no theologian. If the movement had been opposed to the Pharisees in matters of religion, the high priest would even have been pleased, for that was his position also. The only circumstance under which the high priest would employ his police force to arrest and imprison people would be if they had shown themselves in some way to be a political threat to the Roman regime. If Saul was employed by the high priest to arrest people and imprison them, it can only mean one thing: that Saul was a member of the high priest's police force, and his job was to arrest anyone who constituted a threat to the occupation of Rome, by Rome. The last person who would be employed for the high priest in such a capacity would be a Pharisee. Ergo, Saul was not a Pharisee. Just for the record, independent of whatever Maccoby said, we have Acts 5, verse 34 to 35, which disproved that Paul could truly have been a student of Gamaliel, because Gamaliel is in a Sanhedrin hearing where Peter and John have violated the Sanhedrin rules or the warning of the high priest up to this point not to preach Christ. And he says, wait a minute. He puts the apostles outside, and he said to them, to the people who are the fellow judges of this council of Sanhedrin, the law court, men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what you intend to do regarding these men. And now I say to you, keep away from these men and let them alone, for if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing. So all he's saying is, if you leave them alone and it's of God, it'll succeed. If it's not of God, it's going to fail. Paul doesn't take that action. He proactively kills Christians, and that cannot be a student of Gamaliel. Gamaliel is an influential person. This decision in Acts 5 preceded Acts 9, when Paul has this Damascus Road experience, by just 4 chapters and really just a couple of years. So this was well known, Gamaliel's position. Why is Paul killing Christians? Anyway, let's go to the next page of the Maccoby's book. The only solution that makes perfect sense is that Saul was not a Pharisee, but persecuted Christians for exactly the same reason that the high priest persecuted them, because they were opposed to Roman domination of the Holy Land. Otherwise, what possible motive could a Pharisee have to persecute a group of people who the entire body of Pharisees, headed by the revered leader, regarded as pious Jews whose belief in Jesus as Messiah might possibly be vindicated by time? So there you go. We've got a clear proof of why Paul could not be a Pharisee under Gamaliel's tutelage, because he could not possibly want to persecute Christians. He would have known his teacher would not permit that, and was famously said so just a short while before Paul allegedly had his Damascus Road experience in Acts 9. Again, this was based on Acts 5 I just showed you. Next, Maccoby says he's going to turn to the Ebionites, an original early group in Christianity, Ebion standing for the word poor in Hebrew. Here we may turn, not for the last time, to the account of Saul's origins, which was given by the Ebionites, the community of Jewish Christians who regarded him as the perverter of Jesus' message and as the founder of a new religion which Jesus himself would have rejected. You as Christians are almost never told about the Ebionites. Doesn't that sound like you should have heard about them? Yes. But they were very well known, very accepted, very normative, until what? Until Constantine. And then things changed, and books that were just simply summarizing their life were changed from the word schools of thought, heresias, that's all heresia meant, into a book entitled Against Heresy. So now anybody listed there was now a heretic. That's how simple the Romans changed. Just by changing one word in a title, you could make people, every group summarized in there is now heretics, instead of just being heresias, schools of thought. But just something to keep in mind, which was given by the Ebionites, the community of Jewish Christians who regarded him, Paul, as the perverter of Jesus' message and as the founder of a new religion which Jesus himself would have rejected. According to the Ebionites, Saul was not a Pharisee and not even a Jew by birth. His parents in Tarsus were Gentiles. Now, they were apparently of the Benjamite line, but in terms of being direct descendants of a Jewish person, they were not immediately a descendant of Jewish people. They were a descendant of Gentiles first, and then at a higher level, they would have been connected to the Benjamite tribe, presumably. And he himself had become a convert to Judaism, and had thereupon journeyed to the Holy Land, where he found employment in the service of the high priest. This is what the Ebionites are recording. This is a very different story from that found in the New Testament, which has Saul as a prominent Pharisee. That's how his own words or his speech he gives in front of the Sanhedrin in Acts 21. He says, he's asked, why are you on trial? And he says, and Luke even tells you it's a strategy. He's looking at the group and he goes, he knows one group believes in eternal life and the other doesn't. So he says, I'm a Pharisee. I'm on trial because I'm a Pharisee and I believe in eternal life. And that created a division. So until then, nobody recognized him. Nobody thought he was a Pharisee. He had to tell them he was a Pharisee, and he had to then bring up this issue. And it was all a stratagem. Even Luke is showing you it was clearly planned. Luke says he saw this ability to divide the group in two, and that's what he chose to do, is in order to deflect even getting to the charge of what Paul was on trial for. And the reason he was on trial was that his friend Trophimus from Ephesus had come into the temple with him, but then wandered off and violated the sanctity of the inner courtrooms, went past there in an uncircumcised state. Abominating the temple would require rededication of the temple, or God says, I'm going to destroy my own temple. And within a generation, that temple was destroyed, thanks to Trophimus, obviously. This is a very different story from that found in the New Testament, which has Saul as a prominent Pharisee, not so much entering the service of the high priest as deigning to enter into an alliance with him. The account given by the Ebionites has always been rejected contemptuously, both by Christian writers and by modern scholars as mere scurrilous polemics intended to denigrate Paul and based on nothing but spite and hostility. This is the only thing people can ever say. Oh, you just hate him. No, you just test him against the word of God. And what you're reading is the Ebionites' account of the background check they did on him to find out who he really was. And this is their internal statements. And this only appears in Epiphanius' recounting of what they believed or had discovered. But the Ebionites deserve more consideration than this, Maccoby goes on. As we shall see when we come to examine the character and history of the Ebionite movement, it could claim the possession of authoritative traditions. See chapter 15. So he's going to show you that they are more in line with the original 12 that you see in the book of Acts and in the Gospels than any other group. And so why denigrate what they have to say when they do investigations about Paul's background? Wouldn't you think the early church would have done that at some point and then reject him or accept him? And that's why it's so important in our concurrent episodes about Ambrose is the 12, according to Ambrose, and he's writing the 350s, but he knows some historical records that we no longer have. He said the 12 determined Paul to be a false apostle because of his views on the law, in particular, Sabbath, circumcision, and obviously also the food laws. Let's continue. And this next point he's going to make is to say, hey, take what I've just given you as evidence, and that means we're mandated to put the Ebionites back in a more legitimate position because they actually are saying things that match reality. The arguments advanced in the present chapter should induce us to abandon the traditional contempt for the Ebionite account of Saul's origins and give it serious consideration. That Saul was a Pharisee is rendered most unlikely both by his persecution of the Nazarenes and by his association with the high priest. But a person of foreign, non-Jewish extraction, which clearly he's Herodian, we've shown you that from Romans 13, verse 1 and Acts 13, verse 1, he's just the kind of person that could be expected to enter the service of the high priest and engage in police activities which a native-born Jew, resentful of Roman hegemony and of the Sadducean Inquisitorial regime, would regard with hostility and scorn. So no regular Jew would ever do what Paul's doing. It's just he'd be scorned and ridiculed because he's serving the high priest who's really serving the Romans. And if you're a loyal Judean and you love your kingdom that's being held hostage by the Romans, you would be opposed to someone like Paul. And so Paul would be hated by everyone who was Judean. Let's put it that way, because he's serving the high priest and he's serving Rome. It would be natural for Paul, writing to communities for whom he was an inspired figure, to attribute to himself a more glamorous origin than was in fact the case, and to explain his phase of serving in the high priest's police force as actuated by religious zeal rather than by humdrum motives of earning a living by whatever unsavory means were open to an immigrant. Then Maccoby goes on, but how can we even consider such a theory that the Ebionites are correct when so many scholars have found incontrovertible evidence, as they think, of Paul's training as a Pharisee in his own writings? The style of argument and thought in the epistles of Paul, we have been repeatedly told, is rabbinical. Paul, though putting forward views and arguments which go far beyond rabbinical thinking, uses rabbinical logic and the methods of biblical exegesis in such a way that his education as a Pharisee is manifest. Beloved as this view is of scholars, it is entirely wrong. being based on ignorance or misunderstanding of rabbinical exegesis and logic. It would be necessary, therefore, to prove this point before going on to deal with other objections to the view that the Ebionite account of Paul is nearer to the truth than the New Testament account. And so we're going to go now to chapter 7, alleged rabbinical style in Paul's epistles. So look for this next time, and we'll find out more about whether Paul really knew Hebrew.